Yeah, so indeed, today I'm going to present a new idea to enable really a step forward in the area of wearable electronics. And the idea, of course, is to start from what we think of wearables nowadays. So we always think of wearables as gimmicks, for example, that they are similar to watches. We can wear them around our wrist, and they are good at measuring some of our body properties, for example, the heart rate. Of course, you can get, for example, number of steps you have been running on a day. However, statistics shows that normally people get bored with these type of devices like Fitbit or watches after a couple of weeks. Actually, there are statistics from Gartner showing that after 6 months, people tend to actually stop using these devices simply because they are limited in what they can do, and also they're not really reliable. And eventually, actually, the key problem is that they're not truly wearable. So if we look instead at what wearable devices are nowadays, they are similar to watches, most of them. And we can define them really as essentially the standard rigid electronics miniaturized and combined into a mix of interconnections, sensors, light emitting devices, transistors. But the key problem in limiting this technology from actually being really upscaled and also really hosted in several other wearable devices or wearable elements like clothes is the fact that they are definitely not breathable and neither stretchable. So the key problem there to enable, of course, these devices to be more incorporated is to start tackling those issues. So what if we could actually make devices that are, for example, really conformable to our body? So we can think, for example, at elements or electronic components that really take the shape of our body. For example, if you look at the image there, you can see a truly wearable glove that, for example, could teach us how to play piano. Or what if we could think of devices that actually are directly interconnected to our clothes, and they could, for example, provide us information as we move around in a new city, or even more importantly, reliably monitoring our body parameters and giving us information on our health state. Bear in mind that this becomes extremely important in a post-pandemic setting like the one we are living now. Actually, we are still living the pandemic, but it will become even more important afterwards, when you would really like to keep vulnerable patients outside hospitals while still keep monitoring their body parameters. And this has to be done, of course, in a reliable way. So the research in this field, in my case, really started by looking at the wearable computer concepts in the 50s. So the left-hand side image shows what they meant by that. Essentially, it was a miniaturized television that you can wear like a pair of goggles with a couple of antennas, and it was nothing but essentially showing TV channels, but it could be worn on a sort of shape of glasses. So of course, if we move towards 2020, we have improved a little bit of technology, but still we call wearables, or we think we are the forefront of wearables when we combine wearable garments or like gloves together with rigid electronics or metallic wires or interconnections, and these are connected to batteries. So therefore, of course, I wouldn't really call all these systems wearables, and particularly, they could be hardly integrated with our current clothes. So if we need to enable really wearable devices, we need them to really look like something that we want to put on our body for a long time. So definitely, they need to be stretchable. Stretchability is a key element because, of course, you want your garments or your wearable devices to conform to the stretch of our skin, for example, and being really comfortable over time. Of course, if you want to wear them for a long time, they need to be low power. So power is really important. So designing simple and low power devices that could be integrated and stretchable, it's key in this technology. Conformability links up to stretchability, but particularly the ability to really follow the shapes and the changing shapes of the body. Breathability is very important, particularly looking at devices that need to stay in contact with our skin for a longer time to avoid, for example, inflammation or developing, of course, skin diseases. They need to be easy to integrate with clothes, simply because clothes are the garments, the element that the item that we wear regularly every day. So of course, if you want to make things wearable, the way forward is actually to improve weavability, so integration by weaving, for example, with clothes, or somehow patching, for example, with the existing clothes. And last but not least, washability. Because of course, this links up also to the fact that you can reuse the devices many times. So if you can enable these wearable systems to be washable, or at least water resistant, you can wash them together with your clothes and you can reuse them several times. To do that, the current technology is not feasible. So we need new materials, and that's what I started looking into more recently. So of course, I focus on textile because essentially we already know that textile for wearables, it's an ideal material. It ticks all the boxes of the requirements I showed you before. It is breathable, it is highly stretchable, it's washable, and also it conforms well to our skin. Indeed, we keep wearing and we wear it regularly. So of course, textile is a great starting substrate. And we know that textiles can be also modified, for example, using standard dyeing processes. The fact is that, of course, these dyeing processes mostly rely with solution-based approaches, of course, at least water. And also we need to consider that these fabrics need to be washable as well. So I start looking at new materials that can help me in actually tackling this point, while, for example, providing functional properties that go beyond, for example, pigment or color. So of course, I started investigating a material that I'm very familiar with. I've been working 12 years on graphene and 2D materials. So graphene, we know it very well, particularly since 2010, where it won the Nobel Prize, and then the huge investments from the European Union on the graphene flagship project, trying to really move this technology from the lab into the market. Graphene, by definition, is a 2D material. So it's an atomically thin material made of carbon, and it's got an arrangement that looks like a honeycomb shape, honeycomb-like, and essentially being very thin and also biocompatible, it's actually very suitable as a material to enable smart electronic functions. Indeed, it's got many positive features for wearable electronics. It is definitely very transparent, being very thin. It is conducting. It's actually quite stretchable, up to 25% stretchability. It is environmentally stable. There's been a lot of results over the couple of years really showing biocompatibility of these devices and this material. So this becomes really extremely important element to enable truly wearable devices. And the good thing of graphene is that it really leads a family of 2D materials that can be extracted, for example, from layered materials by various processes. I've been leading, for example, research into solution-based approach to do that. And these materials offer different properties, different electronic and optoelectronic properties that are mostly complementary to graphene. So if you can consider graphene as, for example, your electrode, these 2D materials could be semiconductors or insulators. So essentially, they're really a good platform for wearable electronics. And this has already been demonstrated with devices going from touchpad, for example, to haptic interfaces, to energy storage elements or supercapacitors using graphene as electrodes, even to, for example, light emitting devices or optoelectronic devices. And you can imagine that all these devices enabled already with these materials on a non-conformal and flexible substrates have been already the basis for example, new types of health trackers and also well-being devices. So there is a key promise there. However, if we want to integrate these into textiles, we need to make inks and dispersions. And that's where really my research has been leading this field, because I looked at exfoliating, for example, 2D materials starting from layered materials, either in solution, using, for example, shear forces generated by various processes, starting from the simple ultrasonic processes to a very complex and high yield microfluidization process that allows us to get up to 10 liters per day. So you have very large production of graphene inks, and these graphene inks are highly loaded of 2D materials, for example, and it could be, of course, used to make electronic devices, for example, through printing. As I said, this concept is very general. It could be extended to the family of layered materials, and indeed, you can come up with a large range of inks made with these 2D materials. Again, bringing over the same properties that they had at the origin, so semiconducting, insulating, and electrically conducting properties. So these then become a key platform for a new range of printed electronics, that can enable truly wearable and electronic textiles. This has already been demonstrated, for example, to enable flexible organic light emitting devices or flexible printed transistors, or even, for example, touchscreen and even smart windows. So my idea is to see whether these inks can actually be incorporated into textiles using already industrially scalable, industrially relevant printing processes on a fabric, like, for example, screen printing or inkjet printing. And this, of course, requires a technology that enables these devices to be deposited and adhesive to those substrates, to essentially make it washable. So I focus my attention on designing adhesion processes of graphene and 2D materials inks on fabric in order to enable fully printed devices on various fabrics. So for example, you can look at this, for example, fully printed keyboards that actually resembles an integrated circuit. So you have pads, interconnections, battery slot, you have speakers, and then you have an interaction with a motherboard that actually controls the entire device. But at the same time, you can actually consider to directly print, for example, external communication devices like antennas, for example, waveguides. And this can be just enabled by graphene. So of course, I'm going to show you step by step how you can improve, of course, the functionality on fabric, including also the other 2D materials. So to improve the adhesion, I started looking at standard fabric, for example, cotton fabric, that is very well known, of course, in the wearable industry. And I tried to gently modify this fabric. This is a very common process, for example, done for dyeing, creating a thin layer of positive charges by a cationic modification. And then I took my graphene ink and I again modified in order to show negative charges. So as you can imagine here, negative charges and positive charges strongly attached to each other, strongly adhere to each other. So actually we have an electrostatic interaction that improves strongly the adhesion of, for example, our graphene ink on a standard fabric. Then I took my negatively charged graphene ink and, for example, I formulated for being printed by inkjet printing. So here you're looking at a single drop generated by an inkjet printer nozzle, and this carries a very consistent and controllable amount of graphene that you can deposit regularly, drop on demand on a substrate. So for example, this can enable graphene coated fabrics. Here you can see a comparison between a white cotton fabric and a graphene cotton fabric. And then after an ironing process that is commonly used, for example, in textile, you can actually have a uniform and strongly adhering thin film on top of our fabric that looks at the cross section of the fabric. And here you can see actually the top view, there is a thin coating on top of the fabric where you can actually see the cotton fibers underneath. So this is a key technology to improve, of course, the adhesion of the substrate and enabling, of course, washability. Indeed, these devices result washable up to 20 times with standard washing procedures with ISO standards. So this means that we can enable, for example, truly textile, actually in this case, cotton textile wearable devices. Initially, I started using this graphene cotton fabric as a motion sensor. For example, I start looking at the uniaxial and biaxial monitoring of the wrist position using, for example, strain, change, and compression. And this allows to have a constant and very robust way of monitoring the position of our wrist as a function of a change in resistance. But of course, this can be even further improved. We have an IP on this for using it as a pressure sensor. So that's a key point because, for example, it enables to make sleeves or parts of garments smart and actually interactive through, for example, a touchpad. But of course, we want to move beyond simple touch devices. So we start really looking at the opportunities for this new technology into ECG electrode and healthcare application. So we use, for example, these graphene textile electrodes and compare them with standard ECG electrodes. You might know ECG electrodes. They are rigid electrodes that normally are placed on top of the skin. They are made normally of silver chloride. And then what we did, we compared it with graphene textile electrodes. And surprisingly, but extremely importantly, we can actually extract exactly the same ECG signal that you would extract with silver chloride electrodes, with actually a resolution to spot out these PQRST peaks, typical of ECG and very important, for example, to the medical staff. With a big difference that these devices, the graphene electrodes, are actually stretchable, biocompatible, and washable, and they work at low resistance or low power consumption. This is also very important because around 20% of the patients actually can't undergo standard ECG because their skin gets irritated after long time exposure to the electrodes. So this really enables the extra percentage of patients to really get these treatments that they wouldn't get otherwise. We also want to go beyond standard electrodes. We really want to enable truly electronics on textile, removing any rigid component. And to do that, of course, we use scalable printing processes like inkjet printing, and we combine the true power of our platform of 2D materials. In this case, we printed polymer electrodes, and then a layer of boron nitride, which is an insulating 2D material, is actually a dielectric, and then a layer of graphene as an active channel. And we fully print a transistor directly on a fabric. And actually, a combination of these transistors enables integrated circuits directly on a textile, fully printed without rigid electronics in it. Here, for example, you can see a single combination of two transistors to form an inverter, which is actually a simple logic element of, for example, a microprocessor or a microcontroller. So you can see a lot of 1 and 0s here, and that really shows that these devices can be used actually to replace rigid electronics directly on textile. So here essentially you can imagine a piece of fabric with a little bit of printing that actually acts as an electronic circuit, and it does the job of it. Of course, as I said, biocompatibility is also very important, because if these devices need to sit on our skin, or even in the future being implanted into our body for a long time, they need to avoid being toxic and creating first inflammation. So initially we start looking at how neurons, for example, survive on a graphene surface. So here you can see a graphene electrode, and then a network actually of neurons that initially these were just single neuronal cells that actually create and replicate on top of the graphene substrate and create a network. So this type network actually allows them to talk to each other and to actually, of course, create synaptic interaction and, for example, activating in information transfer. So this is a key result because it shows that graphene is not only an inert substrate, but actually promotes, of course, growth of biomaterial, biofilms in general. And more recently, similar results have been shown, for example, with myocardial cells and different types of also skin cells. So this definitely shows, together with other 2D materials, the potential also in bioelectronics and biocompatibility. And particularly, it opens up to devices, actually entire laboratories, that could be shrunk down into a piece of textile. And that's what we're working on at the moment. We're trying to design a smart patch, which is entirely made of textile and actually can incorporate on a cotton fabric an absorbing pad that, for example, take interstitial fluids or sweat, and it conveys towards an array of electrodes that perform multiple readings on different analytes, trying to discriminate, for example, concentration of different targeted molecules. This is extremely important because we can already print, of course, our transistor arrays on cotton fabric, and we can modulate and modify it to be selective to specific, for example, analytes. We have already done this for printed graphene field effect transistors for HIV and for HBV. And talking about viruses, you can understand how important this is as a wearable via sensors for new viruses. For example, in a pandemic period, you can think of integrating these printed devices, for example, on a fabric of a face mask, and being able to monitor actually the presence of viral agents directly on the face mask. This is important, for example, for contact tracing, particularly on a post-pandemic period, when you really want to monitor the contagious and infection throughout the population. More interesting, we have worked more recently on a textile-based display. So this is a very recent work. We try to combine the graphene electrodes together with thermochromic elements. And actually by using printing technology and UV induction to actually cure our thermochromic ink, we're able actually to show specific images directly on a textile. And at the same time, we can use also our graphene electrodes to enable light emission by, for example, a combination of several 2D materials. The big advantage here is that we have a fast switching on a piece of textile. So this piece of textile can really work as a display with no rigid components with a very fast switching. So please really keep an eye on this because this is going to become a very important technology in the future. Indeed, in a short term, what I foresee could happen is definitely enabling light emitting fabric without standard, for example, light emitting devices, enabling entirely textile-based displays or even textile-based sensors. For example, Google Project Shakard is already thoroughly working into integrating sensors, touchpads, but I think that the incorporation of different technologies together can be enabled through, for example, 2D materials. This can bring, for example, to less screens and more integrated surfaces of large panels made of fabric. Also more intuitive interaction, improving our interface with the outer world, as well as, for example, extending the gaming experience, particularly for smart gloves or also smart vision. This becomes on the short term also important to create a so-called concept of body area network, more looking at, for example, healthcare applications, integrating power generators with sensors, different type of sensors that are, for example, interconnected via wireless type of devices. This can definitely improve, for example, the invisible monitoring, highly needed, as I said, to keep patients away from the hospital while keep monitoring them thoroughly when they're really vulnerable. And also, for example, tracking invisibly specific body parameters that are indicators, for example, for infections, for specific diseases being developed. And of course, in the mid-term range, I'm looking at more integrated and responsive devices that, for example, could also being more stretchable and integrated with our body. So for example, the idea of smart contact lenses or biopatches, they could be also implanted, for example, with the skin. Contact lenses have a true advantage of being directly in contact with body fluids. So you can use them not only, for example, for drug delivery, but also to improve our vision capabilities. For example, you can improve the night vision. You can extend the visible range of humans by improving the IR range and getting into, for example, night vision just by a contact lens. But at the same time, you can also think of adjusting the sight. And over a longer range, I see more and more becoming important the concept of bioelectronics. So the electronics, which is really interacting with our living electrodes, which, for example, are neurons, like, for example, integration of nanomaterials or nano machines, or for example, 2D materials directly into our body, not only for drug delivery, but also as a sensing elements, using, for example, wireless interconnection because of their, for example, resonance with light, or resonance with specific terahertz, for example, wavelengths, as well as direct interaction of biocompatible electrodes and our tissues. For example, here you can see a project that we're working on at the moment where we're actually using biocompatible fibers that are in contact directly with the brain surface. This is the dura mater. So the dura mater is the inner part of our skull, and underneath that you have the crust of the brain. And if you can actually improve this interaction, that really leads to an intimate, very intimate contact of biocompatible elements made of 2D materials with, for example, our body. So my vision is not only to improve the quality of wearable technology, but actually to look at a new way of improving our interaction with the external world, for example, enhancing it thanks to these devices. And this doesn't need to be thought as, for example, creating ethical issues, because of course that can be designed around a framework of ethics to work with this. However, it's a possibility, it's a new technology that is well exploited, can really give us a lot of advantage and leverage, for example, towards next challenges that are coming, and we can already see that are coming forward to us. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Felice. It's been great to hear your presentation. I would definitely love to have a haptic screen in some way printed on my clothes, especially now when we're all getting a little bit fatigued of our displays. Yeah. So there's coming quite a few questions from the audience. I think we have 11 questions, so we'll see how many we can get through now. So the first one is, do you think that electronic wearables will end up like smart watches, as the statistic you shared at the start of the presentation, that people simply stop using them after 6 months?
Well, I think that the problem with the technology, the first generation, let's say, of technology that we have at the moment is really limited in what it can do. Mm-hmm. And indeed, it found an area of commercial application in these gimmicks, as we said at the beginning, type of family of devices. Well, definitely you can get meaningful information, but sometimes they're not useful information. So if you want to use that spectrum of devices, for example, in hospital setting or in care homes, it's really doubtful that you can really rely constantly on the information those devices give you. And this brings me back to the fact that because you can't reuse them and you can't rely on them for, for very important processes, like I would say key societal aspects, that becomes a big limitation. So I think in general, the fact that people get bored is because there is a limited and doubtfully reliable expectance from those type of devices. Future wearables, if well addressed, actually can be a game changer in this area.
Mm. And I guess it's a bit different putting on a t-shirt compared to putting on a watch or a thing that is quite cumbersome.
The form factor is very important indeed.
Mm. Are you working with fashion designers as well to make your clothes attractive to the consumer?
Well, I mean, you don't want to look only at clothes, because some of these things are not only clothes focused. It's actually, if you're looking at healthcare, fashion becomes less relevant. However, yes, we do. We have interaction with the Royal College of Arts in London. We're also working with clothing companies, clothing industries, and that, yes, why not?
So we had another question coming in saying, can you foresee covert sonic attacks being monitored via wearable biosensors with information sent to secret services?
I'm not sure really understand the question. So information being captured and shared to secret services?
Yes, exactly, through biosensors.
Through biosensors. Well, I think this is the common issue with big data. I think it doesn't really rely on how data are collected, because biosensors would enable you a new way of collecting data. So you would, for example, being able to reliably collect data from your body, which at the moment maybe you can't with wearable devices. But then the way these data are shared, it really depends on how good is the framework shielding these data from actually being shared with unwanted entities. I mean, it could be secret services, it could be anything. So for example, as I said at the end of my talk, a good policy framework and also ethics framework is very important, but this doesn't really need to stop us from developing a technology. As I was telling you the other day, essentially, you can make a good comparison with a knife. Every home has a knife, and it's really an indispensable, a key element in our houses. So everybody uses to cut bread, for example. However, knives can also be a powerful weapon. So it really depends how you use your tool that defines, how good and how indispensable they are. So if you define a good framework how to use it, I can say why not using this new technology.
Fantastic. And we have a question here from Anna Kupani. Could a similar sensor be used for glucose monitoring in diabetic patients, where a quick and finely tuned response is key?
Of course, this is a great question, and it all depends on the sensitivity of the device that you can develop, and on the concentration of glucose in the different media that you are probing. So with skin-based devices, it's very hard, because you will rely mostly on sweat or moisture from the skin. The concentration is very low. These type of devices also vary, unfortunately, at the moment, their sensitivity according to the position. So it's not really reliable. However, we're working on microneedle type of devices. They can access interstitial fluids, so in the underneath layer of the epidermis. And in that layer, in that region, you actually get a much higher concentration of glucose. And we really think that in the next years, we could actually use a similar technology with improvement on microneedles to achieve that. So we're truly aware of this problem, and we know the way forward.
Fantastic. So it's another one that we should watch this space for the new work coming out. So Ben Lawrence from Kelty says, do we also need better base fabrics and textiles to allow the integration of graphene inks, or are existing textiles suitable?
So we're doing our best to make sure that we develop technology and manufacturing processes that, of course, can be as much as possible integrated and uptaken by industry. But the problem is that definitely being a completely new technology, you need definitely to think of a way to improve also your substrate or directly your concept of fabric. Indeed, one of the last points that I made is that you can also develop devices on the fiber directly and weave it directly into fabric. So this will become less disruptive to the fabric, but also it would enable to completely change your form factor of your material. You wouldn't be using the textile as a substrate, but you will actually integrate your fiber-based electronic device within the weave of your fabric. So becoming more intimate, you know, with the fabric. And this is very important, I think, as a future step. However, yes, I think there should be an improvement also the substrate, similarly to what happened with, for example, flexible electronics on plastic electronics.
Mm. So with this kind of weaving of the electronics into the fabric, we're creating a new type of fabric. Does that mean that the kind of question on washability, where you can only wash it 20 times, completely disappears? Or what would be the kind of consequences of this?
So the 20 times is not a barrier. I mean, the device keeps working after 20 times, but however, what you need to look at is the threshold. There's always a threshold that you don't want to go beyond. And what we saw in our devices so far is that after 20 washing cycles, you go beyond 1% of change of your properties. Mm-hmm. And this, of course, for electronic device becomes really a tragedy because you know, you would change completely your sensitivity, the electronic response. So you don't want that. However, ISO standards are looking at 25 washing cycles at the moment. So we're not far from the ISO standards. So what I believe is that, you know, with a little bit of improvement, and particularly in working together with industry, you know, the ISO standards can be easily matched, particularly for simple devices like inverters or electrodes. So we're not far from that. The story might be different for fully integrated systems.
Fantastic. And I think we can answer one more question and then we need to move on. So how feasible is the choice of graphene, especially when speaking about mass production?
So we actually tackled this point already. I've been working 12 years in developing really scalable processes. So initially, you know, ultrasonication processes or shear mixing were very low yield type of processes. So they did the job, but not feasible for industry. But we developed a couple of exfoliation processes, one based on the microfluidization that enables to produce, as I said, around 10 liters in a lab setting, of course, about 10 liters per hour. So it's actually at a high concentration, a very high yield process, as well as electrochemical exfoliation that really allows, in a very simple process, to mass produce graphene flakes and also graphene nanoplatelets. So I think the production of graphene per se is not really a barrier at the moment. It might be a barrier for other 2D materials, particularly sourcing, you know, all these new 2D materials that, you know, needs to create, of course, a supply chain. And that's a totally different story. But for graphene per se, actually, we already have a lot of graphite in the world. There is a lot of mines already there providing very good quality graphite, and we can already rely on that. So graphene-wise, we're sorted.
I think we'll take one more question, which Ray Shah has asked, and I'm actually wondering about as well. So can these be recycled easily, or is that yet to be established? Because we talk a lot now about hybrid materials and the issue around recyclability. Is this a challenge with these graphene ink textiles?
So looking just at the graphene ink, as I said, there's been, since 2015, there's been a lot of studies showing biocompatibility of the graphene, and also with a chemical modification, graphene can be easily dissolved, so becoming really biodegradable. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of examples for this, and the Graphene flagship, indeed, actually, because it was really aware of this issue, has set up a specific work package tackling this. The problem becomes when you integrate the graphene ink with your textile. In that case, the entire system needs to be biocompatible. We haven't tackled that side because, of course, we rely on what textiles are already available. So ideally, you want to choose actually biocompatible type of textiles. That's why we use cotton, for example, at the moment, which is definitely much more biocompatible. However, the washability tackles a key point, because if you can reuse it, definitely you can remove waste. If you need to dispose of it every time you, for example, do your measurement, like we do, for example, with face masks, you know, with this non-woven type of face mask, that every time you use it, you dispose it off, because that creates a huge waste. So I think if we can improve the washability, definitely it will work towards reduction of waste and so more environmental friendliness.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.